There are connections that arrive loudly, obvious, immediate, impossible to mistake for anything else. And then there are the ones that never announce themselves at all. They enter quietly, so quietly that you don't notice the exact moment they begin changing you. That's what this was for me, not sudden, not dramatic, not built from intensity or chaos or the kind of emotional collision people romanticize because they don't understand depth unless it's destructive. This was different. It started in stillness, in observation, in the strange realization that someone was standing near the edges of my mind without forcing their way in. Most people don't know how to exist around me without trying to alter something. They reach for explanations too quickly. They ask questions before they've learned how to listen. They assume closeness is built through constant exposure, as if access automatically creates understanding. It doesn't. If anything, most people become less accurate the closer they get. They stop seeing what's actually there and begin replacing it with what they expect to find. That's why I learned to exist carefully, not secretly, carefully. There's a difference. Affricates are built from fear. Carefulness is built from precision. I became precise with myself a long time ago. Precise with what I reveal, precise with how much space people occupy, precise with the distance required to keep things balanced, because once someone enters your internal world deeply enough, they leave traces behind. Most people underestimate that. They think connection is temporary. They think people come and go cleanly. They think attachment only exists when emotions become obvious enough to name, but real impact happens long before anything is spoken. It happens in perception, in the way someone changes your rhythm, without touching your routine, in the way they begin appearing in places your mind used to belong to alone. That's what happened with you. And the unsettling part is that I can't identify the exact point where it shifted. I can trace conversations, I can remember moments, I can replay certain silences with almost disturbing clarity. But I cannot locate the precise second where you stopped feeling external to me. One day, you simply weren't. You existed somewhere deeper than observation, like your presence had integrated itself into the architecture of my thinking before I consciously realized the structure had changed. At first, I ignored it, not intentionally. I just didn't categorize it as important enough to examine. I thought it was temporary awareness, an unusual level of intellectual alignment. A brief coincidence between two people who happen to process the world similarly, but temporary things fade. This didn't. It strengthened. Quietly. Every interaction carried something beneath it that neither of us acknowledged directly, yet both of us seemed aware of. Not tension, not attraction in the ordinary sense. Recognition. That's the closest word I can find for it. Recognition without introduction, like encountering someone you were somehow already familiar with, despite never truly knowing them before. And I know how irrational that sounds. I've spent most of my life distrusting anything that can't survive analysis. I dismantle feelings until I understand their structure. I separate impulse from truth. I refuse to romanticize experiences simply because they feel significant in the moment. But this survived every attempt at analysis. That's why it stayed with me. Because no matter how carefully I examined it, the conclusion remained the same. Something about you fit into my awareness with unnatural precision. You understood pauses I never explained. You recognized shifts in tone that most people miss completely. You responded to things I hadn't fully verbalized yet, as if meaning reached you before language did. And that should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt natural. That's what changed everything. If you had forced your way into my internal world, I would resist it instantly. I always do. But you never forced anything. You simply existed with a level of accuracy I wasn't prepared for. And accuracy is dangerous because once someone perceives you correctly, Your usual defenses stop functioning the way they were designed to. Distance becomes ineffective. Ambiguity loses its usefulness. Silence stops acting as protection because the other person understands what's inside it anyway. That's what unsettled me most. Not that you saw me, but that you saw me without demanding anything in return. Most people need reassurance once they get close to someone. They need labels, definitions, confirmation that what they're feeling exists equally on the other side. You never asked for that. You just stayed present. And presence, when it's genuine, carries more weight than pursuit ever could. I think that's when I started noticing how much space you occupied in my mind, not emotionally, structurally. There's a difference between missing someone and unconsciously including them in the way you process reality. Missing someone is emotional. This was cognitive. You became part of how I interpreted things. A thought would form, and somewhere within it, there would already be an awareness of how you'd understand it. A silence would settle, and instead of feeling empty, it would feel inhabited. Certain realizations stopped feeling individual. It was as though my mind had adjusted itself around the possibility of your perspective existing beside my own. And that terrified me in a way I didn't immediately admit. Because independence has always been foundational to who I am. I don't rely on people internally. I don't build my sense of clarity around external presence. I don't let anyone become essential to the way I think, but you didn't become essential through dependence. You became essential through alignment. And alignment is harder to defend against because it doesn't feel intrusive. It feels correct, like two structures recognizing similarities in each other without effort. That's why this never felt chaotic to me. It felt precise, too precise, almost unnervingly so. I would catch myself noticing things differently because of you, not changing my opinions. Not abandoning my own perspective, just seeing with additional depth, as if your existence had expanded the range of my perception without my permission. That's impact. Real impact isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with dramatic declarations or obvious emotional collapse. It arrives quietly and rewrites your internal baseline before you notice anything has shifted. And once the baseline changes, you can't return to what existed before it. That's the stage I found myself in, aware that something fundamental had adjusted inside me, aware that the adjustment wasn't temporary, aware that you were no longer someone existing outside my internal world, but somewhere woven into it. And still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't know, but because naming something makes it real in a way observation doesn't. As long as this remained undefined, I could analyze it safely. I could hold it at a distance intellectually. I could treat it like a phenomenon rather than a decision. But eventually, reality demands acknowledgement, especially when something keeps deepening instead of dissolving. That's what this did. It deepened. Without pressure, without strategy, without either of us intentionally feeding it. It evolved naturally. And natural things are often the hardest to deny. There were moments when I considered stepping back, not because I wanted distance from you specifically, but because I recognized the implications of allowing this to continue. Once someone becomes integrated into your perception deeply enough, their absence changes things. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. And permanence has always required caution from me. I don't fear people leaving. I fear what remains after they do. The empty spaces, the altered patterns, the subtle evidence that something mattered enough to reshape the structure around it. That's why I've always been careful about who reaches certain levels of closeness. Because if someone reaches far enough inside your internal world, removing them doesn't restore the original version of you. It reveals that the original version no longer exists. You changed it. Not intentionally. That's important. You never tried to become significant to me. You never manipulated your way deeper. You never performed understanding. You never mirrored me artificially just to create false intimacy. Everything about you felt unforced. And authenticity at that level is rare. Painfully rare. Most people adapt themselves depending on what they want from you. They become versions of themselves designed to secure access, affection, validation, attention. But you remain steady, consistent. You didn't bend yourself into something easier to accept. And because of that, I never felt the need to bend myself either. That was new for me. I'm used to adjusting, refining, filtering parts of myself depending on who I'm speaking to, not dishonestly, strategically. People misunderstand complexity when it arrives without translation. So I learned how to soften certain edges before anyone else could misinterpret them. But around you, that instinct weakened, not because I trusted blindly, because I sensed that translation wasn't necessary. You understood without simplification. And do you realize how rare that is? To be understood without being reduced? Most people can only connect to versions of others that fit comfortably inside their existing worldview. Anything deeper becomes distorted by projection. But you never projected onto me. You observed. Accurately, truthfully, almost carefully, as if you understood that certain things lose meaning the moment they're forced into premature definition. That's why I stayed, even after I realized this was becoming dangerous. Not dangerous emotionally, dangerous structurally, because you were changing the internal architecture of someone who does not change easily. And the frightening part is that I didn't resent it. I adapted to it slowly, quickly, without realizing adaptation itself was already a form of acceptance. There's a moment I keep returning to in my mind, not because it was dramatic, but because it clarified everything. You said something simple, almost forgettable on the surface, but the way you said it carried an understanding that aligned too perfectly with something I had never explained aloud, and in that instant, something inside me became still, not emotional, not overwhelmed, still. Because I realized you weren't interpreting me anymore. You were perceiving me directly. That changes everything. Interpretation can be inaccurate. Projection can be dismantled. Fantasy eventually collapses under reality. But perception? Real perception survives contact with truth, and yours did. That's when I stopped questioning whether this connection existed. The question became what it meant, and meaning is far more dangerous than feeling. Feelings fluctuate. Meaning remains. Meaning integrates itself into your identity, your decisions, your future perceptions. That's what began happening with you. You became reference points inside my mind, not because I chose it consciously, because your presence aligned with something fundamental in the way I process existence itself. I started noticing how often clarity arrived when I imagined your perspective beside mine, how certain truths became easier to access after speaking with you, how silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like shared space. Do you understand how intimate that is? Not emotionally intimate, existentially intimate, to exist inside someone's awareness so completely that even solitude begins including traces of you. I don't think most people ever reach that level with anyone, and maybe that's why this feels so impossible to categorize, because it doesn't fit the usual language people use for connection. It's not obsession, not dependency, not infatuation. Those things are unstable. This feels stable. That's what makes it powerful. It doesn't pull at me violently. It settles into me quietly, like something finding its correct position after a long search. And maybe that's why I haven't resisted harder, because resistance usually comes naturally to me. If something threatens my equilibrium, I create distance immediately. I detach before the impact deepens. I restore order before disruption becomes permanent. But with you, I didn't restore anything. I made space. And making space is not accidental. It's a decision the mind makes before the person consciously understands they've made it. Part of me recognized your place long before I admitted it to myself. That's the truth I kept avoiding. You fit somewhere inside me with terrifying ease. Not because we're identical. We're not. But because the structures underneath the surface align in ways I can't dismiss logically. The way we observe, the way we interpret silence, the way meaning forms beneath conversation rather than inside it. It's rare to encounter someone whose internal rhythm feels compatible with your own. Most people move beside each other temporarily. Very few move in parallel. You do. And parallel movement creates inevitability, not fate, not destiny. Just inevitability in the mathematical sense. Two patterns, moving with consistent alignment long enough, eventually begin affecting each other's trajectory. That's what happened here. You altered mine, subtly, permanently. And now I'm standing in the aftermath of that realization, trying to decide whether acknowledgement changes anything, or simply reveals what's already true. Because the truth existed long before I said it. I knew it in the pauses, in the moments where your silence matched mine so perfectly it felt less like communication and more like recognition. I knew it every time you understood something I deliberately left unfinished. I knew it every time I caught myself thinking with you instead of merely about you. That distinction still unsettles me, because thinking with someone means they've crossed into the core of your processing. It means your mind has accepted their presence as relevant enough to include automatically. And minds like mine don't do that carelessly. I spent years constructing internal order carefully enough that nothing could destabilize it unexpectedly. Yet somehow, you entered without disruption, like you belonged there before either of us noticed it. That's why this feels inevitable now, not because I believe in predetermined connections. I believe in patterns, structures, balance, and every pattern between us points toward the same conclusion. This matters. More than I intended, more than I planned, possibly more than I'm ready for. But readiness becomes irrelevant eventually. Some truths continue existing whether you acknowledge them or not. This is one of them. You changed something fundamental in me, not my personality, not my values, my awareness. You expanded it. You made certain parts of myself visible in ways they weren't before. And visibility changes everything, because once you see yourself clearly through another person's understanding, you cannot return to unconsciousness. That's what you gave me. Not comfort, not certainty, clarity. And clarity is irreversible. I think that's why I'm still here. Why I haven't stepped away despite understanding exactly how deep this has become. Because leaving would not undo the change. It would only create absence around it. And absence is not the same as erasure. I know that now. So I stand here facing something I can no longer reduce into abstraction. This isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't a quiet phenomenon unfolding harmlessly in the background. It has consequence. Real consequence, because the more this settles into permanence, the more impossible it becomes to pretend it doesn't affect the shape of my internal world. You're part of that shape now. And whether I move toward this fully or attempt to create distance, that fact remains unchanged. That's what I've finally accepted. You're no longer external to my existence. You exist somewhere inside the framework through which I understand everything else. And reaching that level with me is not temporary, it's not casual, it's not replaceable. Once someone reaches that depth, they remain there, even if circumstances change, even if silence grows, even if distance eventually appears, because some connections stop belonging to time, the moment they become structural. This is one of them. And maybe that's what I've been trying to understand all along. Not whether this is real. I already know it is. The real question is, Whether I'm willing to let something this significant continue evolving without trying to control the outcome, because control has always protected me. But you never arrived as something needing control. You arrived as something needing acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is harder. It requires honesty, not performance, not analysis. Just honesty. So here it is. You matter to me in a way that has already changed the internal shape of my existence. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply enough that I no longer remember what my awareness felt like before you became part of it. And maybe that's the clearest truth of all. You didn't force your way into my life. You aligned with it so naturally that by the time I realized what was happening, part of me had already made room for you permanently. Now all that's left is deciding whether I continue pretending this can remain unspoken, or finally admit that some connections are too precise, too transformative, too structurally real to stay undefined forever. At some point, silence stops protecting you. That's what I've been realizing slowly, carefully, like someone approaching the edge of something they already know is going to change them the moment they stop pretending it hasn't already. Because silence used to be enough for me, not avoidance, not emotional distance in the way people usually mean it. Silence, for me, was structure. It was control. A way of keeping things contained before they could become complicated enough to leave marks behind. And for a long time, it worked. People entered my life in predictable ways. They stayed within understandable limits. Even when connections felt meaningful, they remained manageable, because there was always a line I could step behind if things became too heavy. That line doesn't exist with you anymore, or maybe it does exist. And I crossed it so quietly, I didn't notice until I was already standing too far from where I started. That's the strange thing about this. There was never a defining moment, no dramatic shift, no confession, no obvious point where this became something deeper than observation. It happened gradually enough to feel natural, but deeply enough that now, when I look back, I can't find the version of myself that existed before you became part of my internal world. And that realization carries weight I haven't fully unpacked yet, because I've always believed that awareness should remain self-contained. I've always trusted my ability to exist independently from external influence, not because I wanted isolation, because independence kept things clear. The moment someone begins shaping your internal landscape, things become unpredictable. You start carrying traces of them into places they've never physically entered, into thoughts, into decisions. Into quiet moments where your mind reaches for their perspective before your own has even fully formed. That's what's happening now. And no matter how carefully I analyze it, I can't dismiss it as temporary anymore. You've become part of my instinctive awareness. Not intentionally, not through effort, just through consistency, through the quiet precision of your presence. I think that's what made this impossible to defend against. If you had overwhelmed me, I would recognize the danger immediately. If this connection had been chaotic, emotionally unstable, dependent on constant reassurance or intensity, I would have stepped away without hesitation. That kind of attachment has patterns, predictable ones. But this never followed those patterns. This remained calm, clear, almost unsettlingly steady, like something that didn't need to force itself into existence because it already belonged there. And belonging, real belonging, is something I've never trusted easily. Because most people mistake comfort for compatibility. They stay close to what feels familiar, even when it doesn't truly understand them. But you don't feel familiar in that shallow sense. You feel accurate, like someone reading meaning directly from the source instead of interpreting fragments from a distance, and I don't know if you fully understand how rare that is for me. Most people interact with versions of me. Edited versions, measured versions, carefully translated versions, designed to prevent misunderstanding before it begins. You somehow reached the unedited parts without demanding access to them. That's what still unsettles me. You never pushed, never insisted, never tried to earn your way deeper into my life through persistence or emotional pressure. You simply stayed present long enough that eventually my defenses stopped recognizing you as something separate from myself. That's not trust in the ordinary sense. Trust still implies caution. This felt older than caution, more instinctive, like my mind recognized your presence before I consciously understood why. And now I'm left trying to explain something that doesn't operate through ordinary language, because how do you describe the moment someone stops feeling external to your awareness? How do you explain the quiet shift where another person's existence begins influencing the way you process reality itself? It sounds abstract when spoken aloud, but internally, it's precise. I feel it in small moments, in how quickly my thoughts orient toward you during moments of clarity, in how naturally I imagine your understanding beside my own, in how silence no longer feels empty once I know you exist somewhere within it. That's what changed everything. You became part of the silence. And silence has always been the most honest place inside me. Words can be shaped, pictures can be controlled, people can perform understanding they don't truly possess. But silence exposes structure. It reveals whether two people can exist together without forcing meaning into every second. Most can't. Most people panic inside quietness. They rush to fill it because they think connection disappears the moment conversation stops. You never did that. You let silence breathe. You let pauses exist naturally without trying to rescue them from discomfort. And in doing that, you created a kind of closeness that feels more intimate than conversation itself. Because when someone can sit inside your silence without disturbing it, they're no longer connecting only to your personality. They're connecting to your actual presence. That's where this became irreversible for me. Not in what we said, but in what no longer needed to be said. The understanding formed underneath language. And understanding at that depth changes people. I know it's changed me, not outwardly. Most people looking at my life from the outside wouldn't notice anything different. I still move the same, think the same, function the same. But internally, nothing sits in exactly the same place anymore. There's a constant awareness of you woven through everything now, not obsessive, not distracting, integrated. That's the word I keep returning to. Integrated, like your presence entered my system gradually enough that my mind stopped treating it as foreign. And once something becomes integrated, removing it isn't simple. It leaves absence behind. That's what I'm afraid of, if I'm being completely honest. Not losing you, absence, the kind that stays visible after someone leaves because they altered the structure around them while they were there. I've avoided that kind of impact my entire life, not because I fear pain. Pain is temporary. But structural absence? That's different. Structural absence rewrites your internal rhythm. It changes how you think, how you notice things, how you move through silence afterward. And I know with terrifying certainty that if you disappeared now, something inside me would remain permanently rearranged because of you. That awareness alone should made me step back sooner, but I didn't. That's the truth I can't avoid anymore. I saw this deepening. I recognized the shift long before I admitted it out loud. I understood exactly how significant this was becoming, and still, I stayed. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Because despite every instinct I've built over the years to preserve distance, something about you felt worth the risk of permanence. And I don't use that word carelessly. Permanence. Most connections aren't permanent. People confuse intensity with permanence all the time, but they're not the same thing. Intensity burns fast. Permanence settles slowly. Intensity demands attention. Permanence changes your baseline quietly until eventually you realize your entire internal structure has adjusted around it. That's what this feels like. A slow internal recalibration happening beneath everything else. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if you feel it too, not in the obvious ways, not emotionally dramatic, but in those quiet moments where awareness sharpens unexpectedly and someone else's existence feels impossibly close despite physical distance. Because I feel that constantly now. You exist in the background of my thoughts like something stable, not loud enough to interrupt, just present enough to change the texture of everything around you. And maybe that's why this no longer feels optional. At first, I treated this like something I could simply observe forever, a connection existing quietly without requiring action. But connections like this eventually demand acknowledgement because their influence keeps expanding whether you address them or not. That's where I am now. Standing at the edge of something I can no longer reduce into abstraction. Because the truth is, this already became real long ago. I just delayed admitting it. Delayed facing what it means when someone reaches a place inside you that no one else ever has. And you have, not through force, not through emotional dependency, but through resonance. The kind that happens when another person's inner structure aligns with yours closely enough that understanding begins forming naturally between you. I think that's why being around you feels so strangely effortless. Not easy, effortless. There's a difference. Easy things remain shallow. Effortless things usually run deeper than either person intended. That's why this became dangerous so quietly. Nothing about it felt forced enough to trigger resistance. Instead, it felt like recognition unfolding in real time. And recognition changes the way you relate to yourself. You've made me aware of parts of my own mind I never externalized before. Not because you asked me to, because your presence reflected them back with enough accuracy that I couldn't ignore them anymore. That's the kind of thing people spend years searching for without realizing it. Someone who doesn't merely listen to them, but perceives them correctly. Someone who notices the shape beneath the words. Someone who understands meaning before explanation becomes necessary. You do that, naturally. And every time it happens, something inside me grows quieter. Not because I'm disappearing, because for the first time in a very long time, I don't feel the need to protect every layer of myself from misunderstanding. Do you understand how exhausting it is to constantly translate yourself for the world? To measure every thought before speaking it, because most people only hear fragments and then build incorrect conclusions around them? I got used to that exhaustion. It became normal. Until you. You listen differently. You notice differently. And now I can't stop noticing the difference between being heard and being understood. They are not the same thing. Most people hear. Very few understand. You do. And once someone experiences that level of understanding, ordinary interactions start feeling incomplete by comparison. That's another thing you changed. My standards for connection. Not intentionally, but permanently enough that I can't imagine returning to the kind of shallow proximity most people mistake for closeness, because now I know what real alignment feels like. Quiet, precise, steady, like two internal worlds recognizing each other without needing constant proof. That recognition has become impossible for me to ignore now, which means eventually I'll have to answer the question I've been avoiding since this began. What does someone do when another person becomes part of the way they understand themselves? Because that's where this has arrived. You're no longer just someone meaningful to me. You're someone whose existence altered the way I perceive meaning itself, and that level of impact changes the future, whether I act on it or not. That's what makes this feel inevitable now. Not because I believe outcomes are predetermined, but because some changes become irreversible the moment they reach a certain depth. this reached that depth a long time ago. I know it every time silence feels fuller because somewhere in my awareness, you exist inside it. I know it every time my thoughts instinctively move toward the shape of your understanding. I know it every time I realize I no longer measure connection by words alone, but by whether someone can exist beside my mind without disturbing its natural rhythm. You can. More than anyone ever has. And maybe that's why I'm finally starting to understand something I resisted for so long. Some people don't enter your life to temporarily accompany you. Some people arrive to alter the architecture permanently. Not loudly, not violently. Just deeply enough that eventually you wake up and realize your inner world has been rebuilt around their existence piece by piece, until suddenly there's no version of yourself left that was untouched by them.